Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and I read the most amazing thing today. Every now and then you read something that just, the penny drops. You go, oh my God, I knew that, sort of, but I didn't know that I knew that. And Zack Beauchamp wrote this brilliant piece over at the Center for American Progress's blog, Think Progress. The title of it is How Racism Caused the Shutdown. It's a fairly long piece, because he lays out a really, really brilliant argument. And I just was so blown away. I immediately got on the line with Sean and Louise, our executive producers, and said, I want to talk about this with Zack. So Zack is with us. Hey, Zack, welcome to the program.
Hi, Tom, and thanks for that really nice introduction.
Well, it's true. You are, I read your stuff all the time, and you are one of the most consistently brilliant writers, and this piece was just out of the park. Lay out the premise for our viewers and listeners.
Sure. So the basic argument that I make in the piece is that the radicalization of the Republican Party that we're seeing today, that's caused the shutdown and the crisis over the debt ceiling and unprecedented default, potentially, if we really get there, that it was caused by long-term trends that began in the 1930s and had everything to do with race, and at that point, not that much yet to do with economics. The broad arc of it is the following. The Democratic Party, for a very long time, had been the party of Southern racist whites and relatively few Northerners since before the Civil War. And then, right after the Depression swept in FDR and a bunch of Northern Democrats with very liberal economic ideals, the Southerners were all of a sudden a minority. And the deal that the Southern Democrats made with the Northern Democrats is the Northerners would get their New Deal if the Southerners got essentially racist exclusions and other racial policy inserted into the New Deal and no things like anti-lynching bills and so on. Northern Democrats didn't like this. FDR went along with it because it was necessary for the implementation of the New Deal, and Southern Democrats played a huge role in doing that. However, the New Deal brought black people into the Democratic coalition because it benefited them substantially. This led Northern Democrats to become more and more supportive of race-based legislation. There's a bunch of data that we can get into that supports and shows this claim. And that started making Southern Democrats feel more and more uncomfortable. Eventually, with the rise of the modern conservative movement, they found a way to make arguments against the type of activist economic policy that led to integration and uplift for African Americans economically in race-neutral language when they started really losing the civil rights fight. So they could make arguments like it's not the government's role to forcibly integrate businesses. That became a much more attractive vision, and its home was in the Republican Party by this. Barry Goldwater was the start of it, and Ronald Reagan crystallized it. And that led conservatives to leave the Democratic Party en masse, or Southern whites first, and then join the Republican Party. Now, as Southern whites, as new converts, were incredibly dedicated economic conservatives. And this made the party as a whole, through a variety of different mechanisms, more and more conservative, driving out moderates through primaries and through sending signals that the Republican Party was not a party for moderates. As a consequence, you had fairly conservative Republicans driving out moderates, and over the course of time, you ended up with the current Republican Party we see today that's so radicalized and so heavily Southern, where really the most conservative views still lay, that you end up with the kind of controversy, the basic legitimacy crisis.
But to what extent, you keep using the word conservative, to what extent are you actually meaning racist?
I'm not. It's the central part of a central part of the argument is that you don't need to say that the Republicans in office today, and I don't think there's a lot of evidence for the fact that the Republicans in office today are participating in a mass racist backlash against the president, that they themselves really hate that there's a black guy in the office. Rather, it's that conservatism and the birth of modern, there's a little bit of evidence for what I just said, but not that much, that the birth of modern conservatism began partly, at least politically, out of a reaction to racial progress. Right. And so it's very hard to separate in the long run of American history the modern conservative movement and the racist backlash to the New Deal and to things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Right. You said that this started in the 1930s. Thomas Jefferson, writing about slavery, he wrote, and can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated, but with his wrath. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation is among possible events, and that may become probable by supernatural interference, ! The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest. He's talking about race. He's talking about slavery. And, in his later years, I mean, the first piece of legislation that Thomas Jefferson ever proposed when he was in the House of Burgesses in Virginia was to end slavery in Virginia. And he took a lot of flack for that throughout his career. This really, reading your piece, I got the sense, then correct me if I'm wrong, that had slavery never existed on the North American continent, that we would be having a very different kind of argument and debate right now.
That's correct. And crazily enough, political scientists have quantified this. There was a study done recently that found that white people who grew up and developed a political identity in heavy slave-owning districts and counties even today are far more politically conservative in a unique way than Americans who live anywhere else. In other words, that part of the reason you can trace directly a correlation between slave owning in the past and hardline conservatism today. It's a very, very, you can't say continuous in a certain sense because the ideas and the arguments that people are making are very different from point A to point B. But you can say that slavery has created a political divide between the North and the South in this country that's persisted throughout its existence. It probably even predated the United States. Only it was
certainly.
Yeah,
by 100 years at least.
Yeah.
There are those both reflecting the values of the North and or the blue states, shall we say, and the values of the Southern red states, who have suggested at various times, I'm talking about serious historians and thoughtful commentators and observers, that maybe Abraham Lincoln made a mistake and he should have just said, "Okay, see you guys later." Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that probably would have been a terrible idea. And
Why?
the reason's twofold. The first is that slavery was terrible, and slavery was.
But it was disintegrating. I mean, it was on its way out. The cotton gin and.
I think that's largely been exaggerated. The Southern economic system was heavily dependent on slave labor, and the reason that it continued to be dependent on slave labor throughout the Civil War is that it was the most efficient model and was likely to be for an extended period of time. If you created a political system in which blacks had systematically no power and white slave owners essentially controlled the political apparatus of the country, it would have been a very long time, I suspect, before the Civil War, before slavery went away, if at all. It's very hard to predict what history would have looked like. I mean, that's a counterfactual we can't even begin to predict, but I can say fairly concretely that slavery was a moral evil so great that the cost that we paid in the Civil War was no doubt worth it. That it was the kind of institution that you simply cannot permit to exist.
Yeah, that is an argument, much like the Holocaust is happening, we've got to stop Hitler argument, that is pretty hard to refute. That's a pretty solid argument.
That's what it comes down to for me.
Yeah.
That was terrible.
I would not disagree with that. But and yet here we are because of this horrible mistake that was made, or whatever you want to call it, decision that was made by the early occupants, European occupiers of this continent, to have slavery in the United States. Today, this political battle is going on. It's just a brilliant piece. Zack Beauchamp, get over to thinkprogress.org and read this piece, How Racism Caused the Shutdown. It's brilliant. Zack, thanks for laying it out for us here today.
Thank you, Tom.
Great talking. We'll be back.